Welcome to a new episode of Zeroing In, the Science Podcast, the 5th season from atoms to planets. Today, we are in conversation with an Indian primatologist renowned for his discovery of the Arunachal macaques, Professor Anindya Sinha. Professor Sinha completed his undergrad in botany and master's with specialization in cytogenetics from the Calcutta University. Following this, he pursued his doctoral work in molecular biology from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. Professor Sinha's early research concerned the behavioral biology of wasps, social cognitions in macaques, classical genetics of human disease, and the philosophies of human-non-human species relationship, which he studied at the Center for Ecological Sciences of the Indian Institute of Science and the National Center for Biological Sciences, both in Bangalore, India. Over the last 2 decades, his research interests have primarily been in the areas of animal behavior ecology, cognitive ethology, evolutionary biology, urban animal studies and conservation, particularly of primates and elephants, but also of other animal taxa. He is currently a professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru. In our conversation with Professor Sinha, we discover a world coexisting in the crevices of the human world, and with him, we discuss at length the details and complexities behind trying to understand individual behaviors and rationales of non-human primates. So Anindya, before we begin with our discussion today, can you perhaps summarize your research work as a whole for us?
All right. So thank you very much, Shreya, for having me on this session. My name is Anindya Sinha, but the world over people call me Rana, which is my pet name. So I'm very comfortable being called that. To put it very simply, I'm a professional monkey watcher, right? So basically, I've spent the last almost 3 decades studying non-human primates and various aspects of their lives. So it ranges at one end from community ecology, where we've been looking at how different primate species, groups of different primate species live together in the same environment. And much of this work has been done in the lowland rainforests of the Brahmaputra Valley in Assam and in montane forests of Arunachal Pradesh. And from there, we've moved down to single species studies. For example, in 2015, we finally reported a new species of macaques from Arunachal Pradesh. So we've studied the behavioral ecology and the sort of other aspects of the lives of single species, such as bonnet macaques in South India, or the Munzala, the Arunachal macaque in Arunachal Pradesh. And from there, my interests lie in social groups or societies. And we've been trying to look at variability in social systems across many of these primate species. But then, if you study social systems, you can't but be interested in individuals. And this, of course, we can talk about later, but this is something I think is a very important lacuna in zoological thinking, that we, for all species other than humans, we seem to think that if you've seen one, you've seen them all. And therefore, there has been such a lack of interest in individuality. There are also, of course, problems of analyzing individual-based data, but individuality is something that fascinates me. And I've been very deeply interested in individuality, not only of the primates I study, but of course the humans I live with, the plants I also study in the course of my work. And this led me, when you look at how individuals take decisions, to the mind. And therefore, I've been very interested in cognition, especially in the wild. And I've been trying to understand how different primate individuals acquire knowledge of each other, what kind of belief systems do they have, and how do they manipulate these belief systems in others. In other words, how is the mind used in the building up, maintaining, or the breakdown of social relationships in many of these non-human primate societies. And of course, uh, when you think of this, you clearly think of the evolution of the mind. And that will automatically lead you to us humans, because when you understand the mind of the non human primate, you have an inkling of how that evolved finally to be what the human mind is and its enormous capabilities that we have today. So, in that sense, that sort of summarizes my main work on non human primates. But I'll just add a couple of lines that I became, therefore, very deeply interested at a later stage in human non human primate relationships. And this extended to actually trying to understand interactions and relationships between various uh, other than human species and humans. And this again, in turn, led me to a new set of methodologies, that from the social sciences, which allows me to look at both humans and other than humans from a very different perspective from what I have done so far. I mean, my principal work over these last 30 years has been in quantitative ethology, in analyzing data, modeling systems, etc. But now, of late, I have moved more to qualitative ethnographies, also of other than humans. And that has opened up a kind of a possibly a last chapter in my research life. And of course, just to end, I began as a molecular biologist. So my PhD was actually in molecular biology from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And I have been dealing with molecular systems right through this period in collaboration with many of my friends. But it's been a long journey from molecular biology to the social science of non humans.
I mean, it's quite fascinating, especially the point that you have worked in such a huge plethora of fields that it's very difficult to point out your main field of work essentially because this they're so diverse that you jump from one part to the other and it completely changes the terrain of the subjects we're talking about. But yeah, we're hoping to cover some part of it in this conversation. And
Yeah,
so,
so the one point I wanted to make here is that what is really fascinating
mhm,
is that everything that I talked about are interconnected with one another. So, if I want to understand the other than human primate mind, I need to also understand how they lead their lives. And when they lead their lives within a society, they also live in a particular environment where they interact with members of their own species and those of others. Right? And therefore, if you look at the community ecology of humans and non human primates, that also becomes
mhm.
relevant to understand the mind of the individual, right? So they're all interconnected. I forgot to mention another very recent interest of mine. I've been trying to understand the evolution of animal sculpture in ancient and medieval Indian temple art and architecture. And I think the way it connects back, and this, of course, comes from my interest in aesthetics and generally in the beauty of form. But I think where it connects back is when you do this study, you also realize what was the nature of the relationship of these other than humans with humans 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, right? So very recently I was in temple, the Prambanan temple in central Java, and this was built in the 9th century CE. And what was remarkable is that there was a picture of a human being carrying a macaque on his shoulder, and the macaque has his hand on the man's head. And it tells you that there was a close, intimate, individualized relationship between a human and a non human primate in the 9th century in Java, right? And that tells you how old these relationships are and how, therefore, when you consider humans as a part of these natural systems, we are very much integrated in it historically, even today, and I'm sure it will be so in the future as well.
A very natural question that comes here is that the trajectory that you've taken, which is so diverse, was it a natural one or was it a intentional one? I mean, did just things fall into your plate or was it on a checklist? Like, you wanted to explore these areas?
Okay, that's so. I don't think that's a simple question. So one important point that you realize is that what you're calling natural versus intentional is really a part of this spectrum, right? There are decisions we take which could be, in a way, subconscious because I don't think about them actively. Whereas other decisions, of course, are perhaps more conscious. I bring them into the conscious domain because I reflect on them and I take a decision. And I think, as is true perhaps for everyone, it was a mixture of both, right? So I think I've always been very deeply interested in knowing, and knowing can take so many forms. I don't know. I've just been interested in everything, which has also been my undoing in a way, because I've ended up doing touching, tasting so many different subjects that I don't think I've ever done justice to any of them. However, if you define doing justice to them in terms of your own knowledge, your own pleasure, your own satisfaction, then I'm the happiest man on this planet. I think I've got to know so much and I've experienced so much and they have touched every aspect of my life to the extent that my research or the knowledge systems I work with become an integral part of you, right? So I don't think I can distinguish my academic career from my personal life anymore. And hence, if you think of my personal life and how I wanted to live it, my research has been so much a part of it that it has naturally spanned my interests from temple art at one end to the mind of the macaque at the other. And I think there is a continuum in all of this within me that I can justify if I consciously think about it. So I don't know. I don't think that was a very nice answer to what you asked me, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, quite justified.
As a layman to the field of behavioral biology, when I think about behavior and studying behavior, it seems to me like quite a subjective kind of a study,
Absolutely.
you know. But I'm sure there are some objective parts, or like you talked about, there's a quantitative part, and now you
Exactly.
have digressed into a qualitative part. So could you talk about the quantitative part and the primary tools that you use?
Sure. So thank you very much, Fennel. I think that was a question that I have always asked myself, and that many of my colleagues and friends and supporters ask me as well, saying, what are you actually doing in terms of methodologies, right? And so I have, of course, traditionally been trained, like many of us, in Western science models. And one of the hallmarks of course, I'm not getting into the philosophy of that, but one of the hallmarks of Western science models is a very strong dependence on quantification. And the reason why quantification becomes important, I think, is because it fulfills the goal of being objective science, right? Because if I measure a certain parameter, I presume if the three of you go and measure the same parameter under the same conditions, whatever that means, you are likely to end up with similar results. And hence, I think this urge in many of us to quantify what we study was also there in me. And therefore, I used a whole battery of quantitative observational techniques to actually observe my subjects, sampling them, I should say, because you can never enumerate behavior, right? You don't see them all the time. And therefore, you sample behavior. And then you have certain methods of quantifying and analyzing these data so that you come up with certain patterns that can be interpreted fairly objectively by everyone looking at those patterns. There is, of course, statistical analysis that you then use to ask certain questions, test certain hypotheses, or you may do some computational analysis where you simulate some of these phenomena on your computer screen. You can think about the underlying philosophy of what you have studied or the kind of data you have collected. And all of this really adds on to a more quantitative understanding of, let's say, the macaques I have studied. And mind you, this is what I have done fairly uninterruptedly for about 25 years. And then there was a change that came over me. And this was because I was invited to write a book. The book has not been written. I have a dream that I will write that book someday. Most of people around me think I will die before I do that book, but that's a different matter. When I started to think about my macaques and with whom I've spent so much of my life, and I wanted to decide what I should put into that book from the basis of my studies, which were all quantitative. I realized to my shock that there was so little of their lives I had actually been able to capture through quantitative data. And that's when I realized that what I was missing out completely on was, Fenil, what you mentioned, the subjectivity of understanding. And that, I think, is such an important component of, even, if I may use the term, science. And unfortunately, our Western science models completely disregards it. Again, I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion, but it is a very important debate whether the so-called objective science that we do, how objective is it really? Where do human elements of subjectivity actually come in and influence not only the questions we ask, but the way we answer them, the interpretation of the results, the final conclusions we draw, the applications we make of that work? All of these are subjective. Of course, that doesn't mean that we do not make attempts at objectivity, but they are few and far between, if you're really honest, right? Having said that, I decided to take a plunge, and I said I would now, henceforth, for the next whatever life I have, actually follow individuals, human, other than human, doesn't matter, but look at them subjectively, bring in my own positionality in it, and really try and understand how other individuals lead their lives. So when a macaque just looks in a direction and looks back at you, there is so much of information and insights that you get if you can follow her gaze, right? And all of this we lose when we are looking for sample sizes, enough for analysis, statistics. That look is lost forever. And also, having lived with these macaques for many, many years now, you realize that there are certain rare behavioral displays that may take place so rarely that they will never be the stuff of my scientific publications. They will forever remain locked up within me, within my mind and my interpretations of those. And perhaps if I ever write that book, maybe I can convince the audience that science, or the Western science, the so called objective science, is not the only way to understand another human being or another primate, non human primate. So, therefore, and now, okay, and the final point I want to make is that now that I have enjoyed this process of doing ethnographies where I follow a macaque for the whole day, not bothering about what the temperature is, or will I be able to compare this data with what I collected 10 years ago, without bothering about it. It's such a rich world out there, and I learned so much about them that is just incredible. And I do think, therefore, that all natural scientists who work on fairly complex systems, such as humans or other than humans, should very seriously consider also complementing their work with very subjective ethnographies of understanding these lives. I think you only get enriched by them. It doesn't take away from what you know or how you know.
Yeah, I mean, something which is very evident in the way you're describing the whole process is that the idea that we have of science is objectivity, of
Yes,
finding the right answers and things like that. But the way you were describing it falls so much in our understanding of an art.
yes.
It's not, it's like not science anymore. It's basically how you
And
describe
it's a
art.
continuum again, Shreya. Curiosity and observation. Yes, and look, we want to know, why should we restrict ourselves into just thinking along certain lines when I know that those will never be enough, right? What we are afraid of are our subjective views, right? But that does not mean that when I express my subjective view, it is going to be so non rigorous I'm not going to
Right.
write in my book that I dreamed that my macaques were doing this and that's their biology. Of course, I will not talk about it. I will talk about it in ways where I will make it so clear where my positionality lies. I think it will be open to interpretation by my readers. I think we underestimate the capacities of our readers, of our audience, to actually understand what we are saying if you express them in a way where you try and convince them because you're convinced. I know where I see the beauty of the research I do. I should be able to express it and make others understand where that's coming from. I don't think it'll necessarily make it non rigorous or so subjective that it has no meaning for anyone else. I don't believe it.
It's quite beautiful how you put it here. At this point, can you also talk about how you choose or design your problem statements in your research work?
Yeah, so the thing is, I'm again very unorthodox in this. I think I choose a problem because I want to know more about it, right? And that's where I think that although, yes, I would try and frame the question in a way that I then know the methods I should use if I have to answer that question. That's a very natural kind of thinking. I just want to point out again and make a categorical statement that I don't really believe, and I'm really going out on a limb here, but I don't really believe that hypothesis testing is really the only way forward in our science. I think the urge to know, the urge to organize your interests in a way locally so that you're able to frame certain questions, and they can be extremely nebulous, but there has to be some kind of a query in your mind. And then, of course, what is very important is you think of the methods that you would then use to address that query. I think while the query is very important in its own right, the methodologies also become very important because without proper methodologies, and when I say methodologies, I don't mean a very narrow, constrained set of methods. I mean broadly, even thinking about it or writing a poem about a certain subject may give you insights that will add information to that original query you had. So if you then look at these methods, that I think also very interestingly is the most objective part of science. If I tell you that this is what interests me, all three of you may have no interest in it. You may want to ask very different kinds of questions, but it doesn't matter because when I then tell you the methods I will follow to address my interest, it will become very clear to the three of you whether those methods can, number one, address that question you've asked. Number two, how important will the variability in interpretation of the results that you get, how important would that be for you? And how much does that depend on the methods I use? If I told you that, I'm going to think deeply about this problem and write a poem about it first, you will perhaps agree that you may be able to bring in certain insights, but those will remain intensely personal. Because if we were to study this question, we wouldn't write a poem about it, right? So you would then suggest certain methods to me, and I would then debate whether those methods will really address your query or not. So therefore, I think to cut a very long story short, I do think of the methods to be very critical because only after I carry out those methods, get my results, analyze them qualitatively, quantitatively, doesn't matter, will I know whether I have really addressed that original question that I have, right? So with experience, you get a feeling that this is what I should do. This is what I should do if I have to know this. So again, that's a very vague answer perhaps, but that's the way I go about thinking about various issues. Of course, you go back to literature, you go back to how other people have addressed this problem, you learn from them, You sometimes modify the methods, you bring in new insights simply because perhaps of technology, perhaps because of new kinds of thinking, and then you enrich, in some sense, a body of knowledge by asking certain specific questions which you know will fit in with the rest. In fact, one of the important things I tell my students all the time is that it's not important to have a method in your name. What is really important is to go back to what earlier thinkers, earlier researchers have done. Try and see whether you can use those methods, but add to them. Don't start off with a blank slate, because then not only do you not do justice to earlier researchers who have contributed so much to it, but you are often led into a kind of a lane where you find you're very isolated from others, and you don't then have a hope of being able to add your insights into the global body of knowledge. So, to a certain extent, therefore, while we are individuals, we are also a part of a community. And therefore, science or advancement of knowledge also is a collective exercise. And I think we need to pay our respect to the work of others in this.
So you've talked about choosing particular problem statements and debating on what methodologies to use in order to
Yes.
study them. Could you also talk about various factors that influence or bring about certain behaviors uh, in species? uh, how do you account for them? Because you will be carrying out these studies in uh, external observational settings, and you can't really control all of these
Correct.
factors. So how do you account for these factors? And during your study, are you really flexible with changing the perspective
Yeah.
or the approach
Yeah.
that you take to the particular
Sure.
problem?
Again, Fenil, there is no simple answer to this question. I think one of the important points, that the reason why I'm questioning the traditional philosophies of Western science is because much of the Western science models, the philosophical models that we have today, were the work of physicists, mathematicians, or so-called mechanists, as they were called then, right? And the important point here is that they dealt with fairly simple systems. When I did my PhD in molecular biology and I studied carbohydrate metabolism in yeast, I looked at various enzymes and various genes underlying those enzymes. I was dealing with a system which I could create in a test tube. And the only factors that mattered were perhaps pH, temperature, ionic strength, other than the actual molecules present there. It's very easy, I would think, to design an experiment there because you have only 3 or 4 factors to deal with. When you come to the monkeys, it's a different universe. I have absolutely no idea, or rather, I have a very complex set of ideas about why that particular individual monkey chose that particular leaf to eat at that point of time. There's a whole set of genetics, whole set of genes within that individual, which gives it perhaps a preference for a certain kind of a leaf. There's an entire ecology of the availability of the leaf, the state of that leaf. Is it edible at this stage? Does it have too much of toxins right now? Is there an insect that's sitting on that leaf that prevents me from sampling it? There's a whole range of environmental factors that surround it. And finally, and this is what has been largely neglected in this situation by Western science, is that there's an internal world of the monkey. I like eating this leaf. If I made this a statement in my paper, no editor, no referee would ever take it, saying what is like, right? But I think there is a liking. And I don't know how to study it. I don't know how to quantify it. I don't know how to factor it in. The nearest I can do is by saying that other than the genes and the environment, and mind you, the environment of this monkey is one that it has seen from the time of its birth till now. It has experienced so many different leaves, but today it has come to take this particular leaf. And along with this environment, you have your experience. I have tasted this leaf a year ago, I liked it. I tasted it yesterday, it was bitter. Today, is it any different? Let me try. So, if you have a world of this, how would you ever decide what to look for? What are the factors that influence that monkey's picking up of that leaf? So, what we do is, given our background, if I'm a geneticist, I would perhaps go back to the laboratory, try and get some DNA samples from this macaque, look at whether there's a preference for certain kinds of food. Is there a genetic basis to that? If I were a plant biologist, I would say, has the leaf been able to pick up enough level of toxins to make the monkey never touch it again? If I were a primate ecologist, I would look at what are the other leaves that are available, what height is it from the ground, does the macaque like being at that height. I might even look at competition and say, if there was another monkey sitting next to it aiming for that leaf, then I wouldn't touch it. So you have that sort of focus to look at. So it really depends on what your particular field is, what your particular interests are at that time. Is it the monkey? Is it the leaf? Is it the environment? Would the monkey eat this leaf if it was raining? No. Why? Because I know that when it rains, the leaf has hairs that stand up, absorb water and stand up, and that makes it unpalatable to the monkey. So where do you start? Where do you end? You start where your interests are. You start what your logistics allow you to do. And you know that you have a particular question because that's where your PhD lies. And therefore, you take into account the factors that will influence your understanding of that question. Fair enough. And that's absolutely legitimate. And that's what I've been doing every step, right? But today, looking back, you realize that you've just touched the tip of the iceberg, right? Your knowledge is so limited by what you asked. There are so many questions that you didn't ask when you asked that one question, and therefore those worlds will remain closed to you until you ask the specific question. So it's a very humbling exercise when you realize the limits of what you have understood. But remember, there's nothing else you can do. So when a macaque comes and grooms another macaque, which I know is a very common behavior, do I know whether the macaque grooms this other individual because this individual is dominant to it, or because this individual is genetically related to me, or, as in the case of humans and many, many animals, it doesn't matter what your genes are. If you've grown up with an individual, that individual is your relative. Or am I grooming you because I love the color of your eyes? How would I ever know? It's beyond the scope of my science. But the true answer may lie there, and we'll never know. Again, sorry, a very complex answer to perhaps a simple question, but I think I've reached that stage of my life where I question everything. There is nothing firm, there is nothing certain, there is no ubiquitous universal truth. The truth is so localized. The truth lies only in the questions that you've
I'm
asked.
already mind blown.
No, but it's true. I think all of us know this. Either we don't think it through. I've reached a stage where I have a lot of time when I don't get sleep and therefore I can think about these issues, or sometimes we deny the truth because it justifies, right? If I today say I don't care how science is done, I would never get a job. I would never get a publication out. I can say this at this age because I don't need a publication anymore. I don't need a job anymore. But I don't think you can if you're looking for a job. You have to be much more definitive. You have to fit in. You have to conform to what is expected of you. And that is sad in a way. Therefore, I always tell my students, if you can in the future do science or do your knowledge expeditions as a hobby, then you don't compromise.
That's actually a very wonderful advice.
Yeah, but unfortunately, all of us draw our salaries from our
Yeah.
science. And I then fear whether I'm compromising my work for my salary.
I love the word knowledge expedition.
Could you also talk about a specific case that has stuck with you, maybe while you were studying communication in macaques, or some peculiar kind of vocalization if there is, or an interesting way to communicate that you have observed?
Okay. So traditionally, people have, of course, focused on vocalizations because it superficially reminds you of our own language. But if you look at non human primate studies, what you realize is that the richest part of their communication are their gestures. And today, the current thinking seems to be that the gestures of non human primates was the raw material from which human language evolved. And the reason why we think so is that gestures are perhaps much more flexible. And when you use, and there was a student of mine with who I worked on what we called semiotic assemblages. So through gestures, you can just watch me what I'm doing right now. I'm speaking, but I'm sometimes looking to the side. My eyes are wide sometimes. My hands are continuously moving. My fingers are making gestures. No vocalization will ever be able to match this assemblage of signs and signals that I'm sending out. And that is why I think gestures are so versatile in being able to convey. In fact, with my student Rola, what we looked at was, I don't know, I presume all three of you know Hindi.
Yeah, yeah.
If you look at this word acha, so we have it in Bengali as well, acha. Now, acha is a limited word, right? If someone asks you what acha means, you will not be able to give a unique answer to what that word literally, in terms of its sound content, what it means. But if I say, acha, 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 I've already conveyed three different meanings to you using the same linguistic appendage, acha. Therefore, this tells you how important facial movements, body movements, postures, all of these add up to communicate so much more subtle features of what you actually want to convey. So, to come back to my macaques, there are two aspects I want to talk about. So, with a student of mine called Srijata Gupta, we actually looked at the cognitive basis of certain gestures, right? And in fact, interestingly, Shijata's work in this regard was one of the first, earliest ever, to look at whether when macaques use certain gestures, are they pointing to certain objects? And yes, the answer is yes. So when a macaque is grooming, sometimes the macaque who's being groomed will do this, right? And what the other macaque does is it immediately moves around, comes to the part of the body below the arm, and grooms her there. So what the macaque has effectively said is groom me here. It doesn't say here, but it just lifts the arm. But it's a signal that's very clear to the audience because the audience immediately moves across and starts grooming below the arm. So this is an indicative gesture. I'm indicating an object, a part of my body, right? Now, so that was one thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about, and that brings in vocalization, is this that one particular group of macaques in Bandipur National Park, where I've been working now for 20 years, have developed an entirely new communication system to communicate with not other macaques, but with humans. And this is because the humans have been feeding these macaques. These are tourists who go across. They've been in some ways disrupting their lives forever, but I'm not getting into that now. But when they hold out food to the macaques, of course, benefit from it. And what I now find remarkable is that a group of juveniles have developed an entirely new communication system. So, what do? And we've done natural experiments to actually establish this. When a human being carries food that is visible to this particular macaque, she will start following the human being. So, behavior number one, follow. Behavior number two, orient. So, she tries to get ahead of the individual so that she can lock eyes with the individual. So, this is orientation and locking of eye gaze. All along while she's following and orienting, she makes this call. Now, this coo call is something that female bonnet macaques use when they begin their group movement. So, in some sense, it's a coordination call. I want others to know that I want to move. So, I'd say, "Hmm." But here, these juveniles are using it in a completely novel context. In fact, the other call that is reminiscent of this is the lost call. So, when an individual is lost from the group, she gives a call, right? Much louder. And possibly the coo call that the juveniles are now giving is a modification of either the coordination call or the lost call. Why they are using it, we do not understand. It could be to communicate with the human that I'm interested in you. It could be a signal to herself that I'm interested in following this individual because of the food. It could just be keeping in touch in some sense. But then something very interesting happens. If their eyes meet, the macaque holds out her hand. Right? So this hand extension gesture is a completely novel gesture. Today we have more reports of it in other species, but ours was really the first time that we found an individual primate using this gesture in the wild, right? And basically, we don't know what the gesture exactly means. It could either be an indicative gesture pointing to the food, though it's very generally done. And the way you would establish this in science is to do eye tracking, which you can do with a computer screen and which I can't do in the wild. Or it could be just a signal saying, I want that food, right? But what it does to the human is interesting because it's such a human like gesture, pointing out with a flat, upraised palm. People invariably give the food. They would say, oh, this is so sweet. Oh, poor monkey. Oh, the monkey hasn't eaten, I'm sure. And they would give the food. What an effective communication system. And because macaques don't share food with each other, you don't do this to another macaque. You only do it to a human being. And that too to a human being who's carrying food. If the human being is not carrying food, it's a waste of your time and energy and resources to practice this. So that just tells you that in today's world, where your environment is changing completely, you're interacting more with humans than with other macaques, given the kind of environment I'm in now, with urbanization, for example. These ancient individuals are still capable of evolving completely new strategies, which surprise you because you never realize that these kind of complex behaviors could appear, and they're appearing like that without necessarily, I feel, a change in the genetic composition, right? So this kind of what is called phenotypic plasticity or behavioral plasticity is the stuff of evolution, independent of the kind of Mendelian genetics or other kinds of gene effects we are talking about, right? And much of our work on macaques has actually documented this kind of phenotypic plasticity, culture, right? Behavioral traditions, which you know have been established in apes a long time ago, chimpanzees, for example, or gorillas. We have now established many of these traditions in macaques as well. And how are these propagated? Not necessarily genetically. They have the genetic ability to have culture. That's a biological ability. But the exact form of culture that they will have varies from individual to individual, groups to groups, a bit like each of us here speak a different language, right? So we have the wherewithal, the genetic wherewithal to have language. But the exact language that we will speak depends on the environment. And it's exactly the same for the macaques as well. So they will evolve new gestures. They will evolve new communication systems as time goes, depending on what is required for you. And some of them may be synthesized from pre-existing abilities. Some of it may be entirely novel. The hand-raising gesture. Nobody has ever seen that in any other macaque ever before. But now, many of them are using it. And the reason why many of them are using it could be culture. social learning and culture, or it could be trial and error. Each individual has discovered that if I use a certain kind of a gesture, I'm more likely to get food. And therefore, that's another model of learning. But they all add to the behavioral variability in communication that we are seeing.
This was the first of the two parts of our episode of Zeroing In with Professor Anindya Sinha. Zeroing In aims at bridging the pronounced gap between young enthusiasts of science, technology and research and academicians and scientists throughout the Indian subcontinent and even further. Tune in to the second part of this conversation where we discuss further with Professor Sinha about the ideas that encapsulates his understanding of this universe that we inhabit.